This morning, we want to welcome Steve Walz and his panel, and Steve's going to introduce folks, but the goal here was to look at the resilience progress that's been going on around the state since we started working with Resilient Virginia. Main activity, and the folks with now the most experience have been in Hampton Roads, and we are going to have Ben McFarlane from Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. But we wanted to emphasize that as far as regional activity, not only Hampton Roads, but now the whole UVA, City of Charlottesville and Albemarle County efforts. And then Steve is going to talk about all the activity that's been going on actually in the Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. Metropolitan area. So we want to welcome Steve and the panel this morning. Thank you.
As Annette said, I'm Steve Walz, Director of Environmental Programs at the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. So our footprint includes the Northern Virginia communities of, Fairfax, Arlington, Alexandria, Prince William, Loudoun, Manassas Park, and the towns and things within there. But we also cover Washington, D.C. and the suburban counties in Maryland. So about 5.5 million people within our footprint. We have 24 local governments that we bring to the table, as well as many stakeholders. I think I counted about 40 different environmental committees when I started there. That where we're looking, though, broadly as an agency similar to the Hampton Roads PDC at transportation, environment, community planning, public safety, homeland security. And so we bring a lot of people to the table that are really involved in resilience, and we really people think about the metropolitan Washington area as very urban, but we do have the rural areas, up as far as Frederick County, Maryland, and Charles County, Maryland, and then as you go to western Loudoun County, and then we think of also things like the broader food shed that serves metropolitan Washington that really gets into the Shenandoah Valley to the eastern shore of Maryland up to Pennsylvania. So this idea of connecting urban and rural communities is something that we think about and work on quite a bit. And as Annette said, we have the Climate Action Together team from the Charlottesville Albemarle region here, which is this joint effort that they have put together at kind of the staff and maybe more level to build on the past years of the commitments that they have all made, particularly through the local climate action planning processes, and do collaboration, and they'll talk about that some more. And then, as Annette mentioned, from Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, one of the 21 officially designated planning district commissions in Virginia. Again, similar to what we do in Metropolitan Washington, they're addressing economics, emergency management, housing, planning, water resources, transportation through the Hampton Roads Transportation and Planning Organization. They have, I think, 17 local governments on your board. And again, they serve as this local forum, or as we say up in our area, kind of the hub for addressing these issues regionally. And so that we can bring a lot of folks together, again, across the rural-urban divide. So we'll have some short presentations as we get started, and then really more of a facilitated discussion. And I have been told that there might be some roaming mics that might be available at some point. So if you have questions of us after we get into the discussion, we will welcome those questions. Annette mentioned that I would start by talking a little bit about Metropolitan Washington and what really is going on there. We're an area that we see all three of the major types of flooding. We will have coastal flooding. People don't think of D.C. as a coastal city, but we are on the tidal Potomac. The normal tide is maybe only a foot up and down, and so it's not a big tide, but it's more than you might think. And we could end up with, and have ended up with, storms blowing water up the Potomac where it gets funneled in. And actually the water level rises in some of the storms has been greater in Washington, D.C. than even in Hampton Roads because of the funneling effect. So we have coastal flooding, we have the river flooding. Our flood of record in Washington, D.C. is 1936. It happened in the winter when there was some ice that was slowing up the flow, and then there was some very, very heavy precipitation upstream. And there's pictures that show the Jefferson Memorial being a tiny little island in the Potomac River from that flood of record. And then in 1975, there were floods that in Arlington and Alexandria, the neighborhoods along 4 Mile Run, including mine, were completely flooded out. And so, again, this riverine flooding and what comes down can be very important. And then we have the interior flooding from the storms. You may have seen the articles recently from last week's storms that Constitution Avenue in the middle of D.C. was, maybe thigh deep in water from the heavy storms we received in D.C. itself, about 3.5 inches in about an hour and a half of rain. And so it just overwhelmed everything. Up in the northern Maryland suburbs, they got 6 inches of rain in an hour and a half. So we've had flooding in D.C. for a long time. You probably remember the Ellicott City flooding just up towards Baltimore a little bit, that they've had their 2,000-year floods within 2 years of each other. And I think everybody in this audience may realize that when we talk about 100-year floods, 1,000-year floods is probably the wrong term. It's really a percentage. But we've had the Federal Triangle flooding that has caused the National Archives to put up an 8-foot-high wall that can be closed when there's flooding in that area to protect the National Archives. That wall was, for the first time, fully deployed last week in that range. We had, in 2018, 22 high tide flood days in Washington, D.C. And if you're up there and walking around the reflecting pond now, the tidal basin, there's permanent signs out there now saying caution areas is subject to flooding. And so we're seeing that. We see ongoing sunny day flooding in Alexandria and other places now on a somewhat regular basis. So this is something that has really been on our minds. We've been looking at this issue in our region back really before the 2008 climate change report that was put out, that included raising the flag to say we need to be preparing for the impacts of climate change and not just deal with the mitigation side. We, in 2011, 2013, brought NOAA in and to look at their precipitation databases and what needs to be done with them, inventoried all the FEMA flood maps and looking at, what were they based upon and do they need to be changed, brought information forth to the planning community about how to deal with climate change in the planning work, had workshops on adaptation strategies, on vulnerability, and then by 2014, we're looking at how to quantify infrastructure risk from climate change and getting the information into the planners' hands. And then in 2015, looked at more specifically what we can do to build a climate resilient national capital region. So again, a lot of this work. It is now, we're just maybe next week officially starting a study with the Corps of Engineers, similar to what was done in Norfolk, to look at the coastal tidal area flood risks in Northern Virginia and do some better modeling of those and develop adaptation options to be able to protect the critical infrastructure in those areas. And so it's not been officially launched because we're doing some official paperwork with the Corps, but I think the official launch will start next week on our coastal flood study for Northern Virginia. So we're looking forward to kind of digging in deeper. There's been a lot of other efforts going on. The Northern Virginia Regional Commission, and I guess Corey Miles spoke yesterday about some of their work at her session. But they have their Resilient Critical Infrastructure Roadmap for Northern Virginia and have been doing some really good work in looking at risks and looking at specific risks in the area. They're also got a really interesting study that they tell us that we should be receiving results by the end of the year they're using something called the Thriving Earth Exchange, or the TEX program, through the American Geophysical Union, where they are bringing in volunteer scientists. And this is something that the AGU is really looking for ideas elsewhere, too, to be able to bring volunteer scientists in to do work that is critical to the communities. And so in our area, they're looking at 3 watersheds, and they're doing some downscaling of precipitation events and then modeling of the hydrology in these watersheds. And we'll be looking at various flooding scenarios based upon rainfall and riverine events. And so if you're interested, you ought to look up the Tex Exchange work at the AGU as an opportunity to have some things that you could do. And we're really excited about partnering with NVRC on that work. Elsewhere in the region, there's really, as we started to kind of pull things together to look at where are their gaps and what are they doing, we're finding that we're really blessed in the DC region with quite a bit of work. In the district itself, they have their Climate Ready DC plan that they brought in consultants to look at future conditions and risks and vulnerabilities and develop this plan. Particularly, they have technical reports that have climate projections and scenario development. So they're looking at the numbers of days over 90 degrees and 100 degrees moving forward at various points in the years. And so, again, if you're looking for that type of data, they've got some really good consultant work. They're beginning to do resilience design guidelines for their public buildings, for the waterfront development, and for the roads. So, again, more work being done there. They were fortunate to be in the last round of the 100 Resilient Cities work and now have the Resilient DC plan that is really looking broadly at sustainability from what happens in the communities east of the Anacostia that are more subject to economic impacts from activities that are going on, to cyber, to climate, and others. And they really have goals of having inclusive growth, smarter DC, climate action, and then safe and healthy Washington. So again, they have set up within the district government a resilience cabinet to bring all of these different department heads together to be able to do the coordination of the activity across the many, many department heads. And so I think the resilience cabinet that they put together is something that is particularly noteworthy and is something to try and emulate, I think. Their Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency has incorporated climate change into the DC Hazard Mitigation Plan. And so, again, they're not just looking backwards, but looking forwards with their work. They just are finished up a redo of the comprehensive plan for the district, where they are addressing climate resilience directly in that. They are just about, I think, when the new budget year starts, and the budget years in the district start in October, are going to start a $5 million flood mapping effort across the full district to look at tidal, riverine, and inland flooding, and look at the stormwater systems and what it can hold or not, and really get a much, much better model of what's going on in the district. They're also doing some interesting outreach work. For example, they've set up in an area, again, east of the Anacostia in the Watts Branch area, whether they're having people out in the community knocking on doors, going to community events, asking what the residents in these areas really would like to see out of this work, and reaching out into the communities that we don't always reach out into and address, to be able to address some of the equity issues involved in this work, and actively going out and reaching those voices. And so Dennis Chestnut and other folks who work in those communities are involved in that work. They're building resiliency hubs around the city, so they're kind of going beyond the idea of cooling centers. They'll be starting an update of their energy assurance plan shortly. We're looking at things like, what effect does the closure of the refinery up in Philadelphia have on the petroleum supply systems that serve up through the Colonial and Plantation pipelines and serve much of Virginia through that, from kind of Roanoke to Hampton Roads. And then they're looking at their interconnection rules for their utilities with storage systems and islanding microgrids, and being able to reform the interconnection agreements, not just for PV systems, but for these other systems too. So really a lot of work there. Elsewhere, Alexandria, I've seen one person, at least from Alexandria here, they updated their IDF curves and looking at sea level rise data and doing that. They're looking at their municipal, kind of a municipal campus where their police and public safety and transit and things are, and they're looking at the resiliency of that municipal campus. Arlington County is just finishing up redoing their community energy plan, that they have a new goal in there to ensure Arlington's energy resilience. And they're also starting an 18-month flood hazard study looking at overland flooding in those areas. And so, again, these results will be coming out and be shareable with others. Fairfax County has just adopted their Fairfax Green initiatives, including directing development of a climate resiliency and adaptation plan. So the largest jurisdiction in Virginia at 1.2 million people or so are now much more actively starting to work on this. Elsewhere, the city of Frederick, Maryland, has used the University of Maryland to forecast climate change impacts on the Frederick City watershed. And that report is out there for people to be able to look at how UMD was taking this approach. Gaithersburg, Maryland, has included NASA climate projections in the environmental elements of its 2009 master plan. So again, how do we incorporate this into the broader community planning efforts as part of the work? Montgomery County and Tacoma Park have both declared climate emergencies, which is kind of maybe it's a little of a trendy thing to do right now, although Montgomery County did it in 2017. But they're looking at things like the microgrid projects that they've done at their public safety headquarters, that is a fully solar and battery-backed microgrid system there to keep them running, and also at their correctional facility. Prince George's County, Virginia is similarly developing microgrid systems that will include not only some county facilities, but grocery stores and pharmacies and things, so that if with blackouts in other areas, they'll be able to keep some of these services going. Even the town of Vienna, one of the smaller communities in our area, has in their comprehensive plan their chapter on environmental and sustainability that sets the stage and calls for resiliency actions and other things being done. So a lot at the local level, and then at the regional level, the National Capital Planning Commission, which is really the planning agency that all the federal projects have to go through and receive approval on, but they have their Monumental Core Adaptation Working Group. They did a flood risk resource guide in 2018 that is available to everybody. I think Virginia has a Silver Jackets group, and there's a DC Silver Jackets group that works. And then also covering this area too, the Narissa, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Group, has a data portal with a lot of data on flooding and other things that are available, and are about, as we understand it, to put out county-level fact sheets that are under development. So keep your eye on Narissa. Another thing we don't always think about in this area is just, who's doing what in the FEMA community rating systems. We do have Alexandria at 6, Arlington at 8, Fairfax County, Falls Church, Frederick, Prince George's County, Prince William County, and Vienna, all at various ratings in it, and as a way to make sure to do the right things to manage some of the flood risk, and also then get their residents a discount on their flood insurance. We've got the National Park Service working on their NCR, National Capital Region Emergency Flood Plan for their properties. And some interesting work that is now being spread out much broader, but working with the University of Portland. NOAA did the heat island mapping in DC and Baltimore in 2018. And so that's some really interesting work that they did in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening to look at the diurnal changes in the amount of heat. Something that when the low temperature in DC today is supposed to, the dew point and the low temperature tonight will be in the 80s. And so that really helps, we're looking at how that builds up. They also found a 17-degree differential in the afternoon between the treat areas in Rock Creek and some of the other areas that were much more, with a lot more pavement. And that's a big, big temperature change. And so looking at, again, what can our urban forests do to help us out? We have groups like the Blue Plains Advanced Wastewater Treatment Plant with DC Water. They're building the wall around the multi-billion-dollar investment that they have to a 500-year storm with 3 foot of freeboard above that, to be able to protect that interest and keep being able to work during flooded conditions and not be dumping raw sewage into the river. It's interesting to think about the levee systems. Again, people don't really think about that in Washington, but the Anacostia River levee system goes back to 2014. But now we're looking at how can we keep that from disconnecting with the wetlands and things behind that, and how can we rebuild the systems to be more resilient. A lot of people don't realize that there's a levee on the National Mall, and they've got a place where they can close off with gates, the 17th Street opening. And so that's a really interesting example of how you can blend the type of levee systems into an urban environment where most people don't realize it's there, but it'll keep the Potomac River from coming back in and flooding the monumental core of the district. We've got I mentioned the 8-foot tall flood barrier at the National Archives, and the Department of Commerce is building protections for their 200-year storms, and so for the inland flooding. We've got the Alexandria Old Town waterproofing up to 6 feet, and the Huntington levee in Fairfax County. So really a lot of things that are going on. And so I hope this has given you a flavor of what we're doing in Metropolitan Washington. Our challenge and our goal is to try and knit this together and have it more widespread, and so not just have these one-off examples here and there. And that's what we'll be working on going forward, and using some of the examples that we'll hear about now and learning from them. So I'd like to turn it to the team from the Albemarle County, Charlottesville, UVA to talk a little bit about their work, and then to Ben in Hampton Roads, and then we'll start with questions.
Excellent. All right, thank you. So my name is Susan Elliott. I work with the City of Charlottesville and the Climate Protection Program. And I'm going to do a kind of brief overview of what Climate Action Together is, and then I'll dive in a little bit more to what we're doing specifically at the city. So I think it was probably about 9 months ago, what we started to realize was that the University of Virginia, Albemarle County, and the City of Charlottesville were all going to be pursuing different efforts around climate action. Specifically, we were going to be updating or adopting new reduction goals around greenhouse gas emissions, and also then developing or refining what we had for our climate action plans. All three of the processes are being driven by different motivators, and all three of them have different timelines. All three of them also have different governing boards. However, it happened to be that all of our timelines were coalescing over the same time period. And so as we were talking to each other and as we were talking to members of our community, what we kept hearing was that this was going to be very, very confusing, number one. And number two, that people didn't want to have to go to 3 separate meetings all at the same time in the same week to say the same thing 3 different times. The other thing that we kept hearing was that from the perspective of our community, they live in Charlottesville. They don't necessarily see a distinction between, are they in Albemarle County, are they in Charlottesville City proper, they're a member of the university, and that kind of bridges back and forth between those. And so for them, one of the other pieces was that ties into that idea that they didn't want to have to keep repeating the same thing over and over again, was that they look at our community as a single community. And they see those values and what we should be achieving, they see that ingrained across what that fabric is of our community. So to try to help to coordinate and explain to anyone who is interested, because people come into the public conversations at different times, in terms of what we were each doing and how that looked as our separate processes, but things that we were trying to coordinate back and forth in kind of an informal at a staff level. We ended up setting up a website called climateactiontogether.org. And on there, it gives a bit of a background of what we have done as a regional community. The idea of how are we being environmental stewards? What does that mean in terms of our policies, our commitments? What sort of planning activities do we do? What are investments? That actually goes back several decades in our area. And over time, as different terminologies have come up, the ideas of sustainability, the ideas of resiliency, the ideas of adaptation, all of these things that have been building and folding in these previous efforts. And so sometimes we have things that aren't necessarily called by the same name, but we have efforts that if you actually look at, well, what does a resiliency plan include? We have different efforts that are pointing towards that. And so to try to give kind of a briefing for people and point them towards resources of where we have done joint collaborative efforts in the past, as well as explain what our different processes are right now, and then create a space that people could go to see what are the current actions or activities right now, and then how do you connect to each organization separately so that you can really dive into what they are doing. That was why we started this climate action together. It seemed a lot simpler in terms of communication than saying, this is the city's climate action, this is the county's climate action, this is what EPA's climate action is. So then coming out of that, a lot of what we've been doing is what I think has happened behind the scenes, but we're making it a little bit more public in the sense that our organizations and staff do work together behind the scenes. We trade information, we ask about what are you hearing. If there is a framework or some sort of guidance standards that we need to look at, we're asking each other usually, what are you using? What are you hearing? And through the Climate Action Together piece, we're making that a little bit more concrete. We're making the fact that we do have those conversations a little bit more transparent out to the community. And in addition to that, I think there's also, there's, at least on the city side, I would say, we're very intentionally looking at what's coming out of the different processes of where the university is landing, where is the county landing, and how can we roll that into what we're developing. So I mentioned earlier that there's different motivators. In 2017, the city of Charlottesville committed to the Global Covenant of Mayors commitment, and that basically is structured in the way that there's two different tracks. One that focuses on greenhouse gas emission reduction, so you're looking at your mitigation efforts. The other is looking at the adaptation. Each of those tracks is broken out into 3 different phases. Each phase builds on the previous phase. So where we are on the mitigation one, which is where we'd also had most of our experience in the past, was we needed to update our greenhouse gas inventory. We had to adopt a new greenhouse gas emission goal, which our council did that on July 1st, so we now have our new goal. And then the third phase of that is going into climate action planning. And so that's going to be over the next year that we're going to be looking at that. There are previous activities. Like I said, we've been working on some of this for decades in terms of environmental stewardship. The city's climate protection program was actually established in 2007, so we're not starting off from scratch on it. And that's one of the things that we want to do is also make sure that we're rolling in the past efforts and experiences that we have, as well as what are new opportunities. And I think that's something that, just from the sessions I was able to attend yesterday, is one of the big overriding themes is that there's more technology, the market's changed, the urgency of what we're seeing in terms of the climate challenge is becoming much more palpable and present. And if people are looking at how do we find solutions from all various parts of society and bring those in. On the adaptation side, what that process looks like from the Covenant of Mayors is to identify what your climate hazards are, look at what sort of climate projection data there is in terms of what you can expect to be seeing happen, and then start coming up with your adaptation plan. There are definitely communities that have big enough staffs that they can be running both of these processes simultaneously. Here, they're kind of like leapfrogging each other a little bit, where one of the tracks kind of gets to one point where it can then pause or go out for public input, and then activity can start on planning and working on the other. So which I think actually ends up making it a nice organic way that as you come up and identify things in one of the tracks that relates to the other, you have an opportunity to fold that in. And I would say that's also what we're then looking at, what we're seeing, and as like Narissa and Andrea will talk about, where the university is and where the county is in terms of their action planning. They've formalized what their process is and like what they're putting down on paper for before where the city is right now. And so we're looking very intentionally on how can we roll those pieces in so that when we start off, we're not starting off where just the city was, but we can really build on what they've heard from the community and what they've already put time and effort into. So with that, I'll hand over to Andrea.
Thank you. My name is Andrea Trimble. I'm director of UVA's Office for Sustainability. We have 12 full-time staff, over 20 student employees, and hundreds of volunteers every year, so many of whom are here working on zero waste and other logistics for the conference. We work pan-university on strategic planning, program and project implementation across topic areas. So one reason I find this job so interesting and exciting is that higher education plays a really important role in both climate action and resilience. We're educating current and future leaders. We're both in and out of the classroom. We're conducting research with global impact. And then we also operate on a scale that has significant environmental impact if it's left unmitigated. UVA has over 550 buildings, over 16 million square feet, over 20,000 students, over 17,000 faculty and staff, and we're continuing to grow significantly, particularly in terms of square footage. Just since 2009, which is our greenhouse gas baseline, we've grown about 17% in terms of population, that's about 6,000 people, and about 15% in terms of building square footage, and that's 2.3 million square feet since 2009, and we're anticipating significant growth in the coming years too. So today, our climate action and sustainability approach, and likely as we increasingly focus on resilience, we framed it around 3 areas. So engage, steward, and discover. So how do we engage our community and build up awareness for action? How do we steward our resources? And then how do we engage in curriculum research and using the grounds as a living lab to catalyze sustainability action? Our current climate goal is a 25% reduction below 2009 levels by 2025. So far, we've reduced emissions about 17% despite growth. So we're expecting to reach the goal early. So as Susan mentioned, we're in the process of developing what our next goal is, and we expect that to be significantly more aggressive than what we have right now, and we expect to announce that relatively soon. So as we know, climate action planning and resilience planning is important in the face of climate change, but it's a relatively new concept for universities to undertake in a strategic, sort of integrated way. Second Nature, which is a higher ed nonprofit related to helping universities advance sustainability, has had a president's climate commitment for several years, and over 500 schools have signed on. They now have a resiliency commitment that's relatively new. So universities are starting to pick up momentum in how we formally address this, but we still have a long way to go. And what's a little bit different and more formalized about the resiliency planning is for universities that it does go so hand in hand with the community work. It's really important for universities and communities to play a leadership role in reducing vulnerability and enhancing the ability to adapt, but that has to go really hand in hand. And really the climate action planning should, but it's been even more deliberate with the resiliency planning. So UVA has a really strong resilience research initiatives. If you were here yesterday, you heard from Karen McGlathery and the Environmental Resilience Institute. In terms of the operations, you saw probably, if you were here yesterday again, you saw Annette show the circle of what is a resilience community and what are some of those components. Second Nature and campuses have a similar sort of circle that includes financial aspects, health and wellness, social equity and governance, infrastructure and ecosystem systems or services. And we're doing pieces of this. So for example, a couple of them are health and wellness. The indicator is food supply, and then the metric is percent of food sourced locally, which is something that UVA Dining is making great progress on, is tracked regularly. Or another one is infrastructure, and then the indicator is waste management, and then the metric is annual volume of waste sent to landfill. So we incorporate those sort of things into our sustainability plan, but there are also resilience indicators and resilience metrics that are tracked. But there's lots more to that we need to sort of formally bring in, things like the number of animal species on campus and biodiversity, the number of dollars invested in adaptation projects specific to the university and things like that. But it's an exciting time as we launch our new climate action plan and as we increasingly work together on resilience. So there's lots more to come.
I know, all the microphones. I'm Narissa Turner. I'm the Climate Program Coordinator for Albemarle County. And as Susan previously mentioned, although there's this recognition that we all have different processes that are kind of coalescing around similar timelines, the drivers of those processes are a little different. And so I'd say for the county, I think it was really driven by our elected officials, our board, and then also the community members that they were hearing from that started this process and allowed for the creation of my position. And so our process started with a broad understanding that we knew we needed to do more in the way of climate action planning and to some level resiliency as a whole. The way I've been thinking about it as we've been, and to clarify, like we're still right in the middle, in the thick of this process, and so it's not complete, but the way I've been thinking about it and how this fits into the larger conversation of resiliency is that this is kind of a real proof of concept. Like, if we can do this really well with our climate mitigation, we should be able to scale this up and build out the scope for larger resiliency planning. And as Andrea was mentioning that, like for similar to UVA, I see within the county lots of different sort of concurrent processes happening that speak to resiliency, with us updating and reviewing our water infrastructure, our changes in the way we pursue economic development, changes in the way our planning department is building up infrastructure that speak to resiliency. It's just not necessarily done with that term in mind. And so as we've been going along our climate action process, in my mind I've been thinking, well, how do we tie in all these pieces? Another thing I will say is, as Susan mentioned, sort of the way her process is set up, she's been trying to like leapfrog like her mitigation track along with her adaptation track, and we've been kind of like piggybacking and working together on that, because although we're right now very focused on mitigation, we've been working with the city and some of the pieces that they've been doing with adaptation and trying to figure out how to trade information, so by the time we get to the end of our climate action mitigation process, she has information that she can roll up, and as she works through her adaptation and also her inventorying process, she has information that we can trade and make that process a lot more efficient, sort of trading best practices, caveats, and things to look out for, things to avoid. And it makes for a very efficient climate action planning and hopefully building into resiliency processes. We're sort of laying the foundation here is how I see our climate action together team working.
Well, thank you very much. And we'll get into some questions later. But before that, we'll have Ben talk about what's happening down at the bottom end of the Golden Crescent here with Hampton Roads.
Right. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back in Charlottesville. I'm a UVA grad, so it's always fun to be back on grounds. As Steve mentioned, I'm from the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. I'm in our Water Resource Department, so stormwater, coastal resilience, flooding, these are all the things that we work with, that we focus on in our part of the PDC. We do have 17 jurisdictions, 10 cities, 6 counties, and 1 town, a diverse range of communities. The largest city in Virginia, the city of Virginia Beach, in terms of population, the largest city in terms of area, I think, is Suffolk. And then we also have quite small and rural communities as well. We share Surrey County with the Crater PDC. We share Gloucester County with the Middle Peninsula PDC. And our jurisdiction goes all the way west to Southampton County as well on the south side. So a diverse range of communities, a diverse range of capacities in those communities, and priorities and desires and wants. And so coming together regionally to focus on issues like resilience is at times challenging, but I think we've had a lot of success over the years. For those of you that aren't as familiar with Hampton Roads, we're also home to numerous military and federal facilities, including the world's largest naval base, the Naval Station Norfolk. So it's not just a problem for us that we flood. We think it's also a problem for the nation, and so we'd really like to get some money from everyone else. So if you could just leave some donations out.
You'll have some competition there.
Our focus initially on resilience has been on coastal flooding. Like many coastal areas, we're vulnerable to hurricanes. We have significant experience. I believe our storm of record is the 33 hurricane. So, but what we're finding more recently is that it's not just coastal storms that are starting to cause us problems. It's also rainfall overloading our stormwater management networks. It's also wind. For those of you that are familiar with the southern parts of Virginia Beach, that area is now getting, when the wind is out of the south, that area is starting to flood more and more frequently. So figuring out what we're going to do about flooding when it's coming from 4 or 8 different directions at once is something that's preoccupying many of our cities and counties right now. I think the key takeaway is that for us, we are America's first region. We are been there for about 400 years, give or take. So we're old, we have lots of stuff. It's in areas that are vulnerable to flooding, and that problem's not going away. And so we're having to try to deal with it and come up with solutions that work. Our work at the Planning District Commission really took off about 10 years ago. And for a number of the Planning District Commissions in Virginia and the coastal area, we've received funding from the Coastal Zone Management Program to do some work on resilience, on sea level rise, on climate change. For those of you that may remember, climate change and sea level rise were verboten terms for quite some time in Virginia. Figuring out what euphemisms were allowed was a challenge from time to time to figure out what we could say to the General Assembly and what we couldn't say. And so this funding that we were able to get from the CCM program, and I'm not just saying that because you're here, Shep, and you're the funder, but was, I think, really critical for us in building the capacity that we now have to address these issues at the regional scale. And I say that not just for Hampton Roads, but also for Northern Virginia, for the Eastern Shore, and for the Middle Peninsula as well, that also receive similar grants. And at the local level, we've had a number of our localities have extensive experience with doing something about flooding. Norfolk put quite a bit of resources and time and money into working with the Dutch firm Fugro to engineer some solutions, which is now informing some of the work they're currently doing. And then two of our localities, Portsmouth and Gloucester, have pretty stellar floodplain management programs. So if you're interested in the CRS program, I would heartily recommend that you go and check out the programs they have and give them a call, because they've done a lot of good work with that over the years. At the Planning District Commission, we have recently established a program, so our localities have opted to contribute a little bit extra money to our budget every year now to focus on coastal resiliency issues. So we have, it's kind of a four-pronged program. We're trying to develop policy recommendations. We coordinate not just with our localities and between them, but also with state agencies, federal agencies, and academic institutions. We help advocate for state and local and federal changes to regulations and laws and policies. And from time to time, there's actually something that we can solicit money for and implement on the ground, usually not construction, but something to do with sensors or data gathering or something like that. And over the years, we've done, the last couple of years, we've I think, made a lot of headway in, turning some of the talk that we've had over the last decade into changes, into real action at the local level and at the regional level. On the policy front, last fall, our commission adopted a set of regional sea level rise planning scenarios, 1.5 feet by 2050, 3 feet between 2050 and 2080, and 4.5 feet between 2080 and 2100. That work is now informing local comprehensive planning efforts. It's been tied into local planning work that's being done for in terms of engineering solutions with the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth and Virginia Beach, and also Hampton. So we're really proud of that, and we're working on turning that into implementation guidance right now with our Coastal Resiliency Committee. And a couple other things that we're currently working on, like I mentioned, we're taking those scenarios, working on turning those into design flood elevation recommendations. So right now, most of our communities have a base flood elevation requirement for their floodplain management programs, but we want to start projecting those into the future because we know that sea level is rising and it's not going to slow down anytime soon. And then also, we're working with a number of our localities to update design storm standards and criteria for infrastructure. I want to throw a shout out to the city of Virginia Beach for doing a lot of the work in this area of funding some of the research that's gone into making so that we can understand how our climate is changing and use that to make better decisions when we're actually building things like stormwater pipes or roadways. On the data front, we've partnered with the United States Geological Survey. They are going out and they are measuring benchmarks. So we have a subsidence problem in Hampton Roads. We're sinking. It's a very small amount of subsidence every year, about 2 millimeters per year. But getting an understanding, that's a regional average, but we'd like to understand better how that regional average, how it varies across our region, but also what the potential causes of that might be, because if you know why it's happening, then you can possibly come up with a policy solution. If you don't know why, then you're just kind of, you're aiming blindly. We are working on a proposal to install flood sensors on area roadways to work with our locality. Several have already looked at installing or have installed sensors over on overpasses, over creeks and rivers. We want to start looking at roadway flooding sensors so that if you can actually have an alert on Waze or Google Maps that would say this intersection is blocked, don't go here, or it would actually actively reroute people if they're using one of those mapping apps. So I don't know exactly what the timeline is for that, but it's something that we're really excited about. And also another thing that we just recently released, we have a resilience project tracking dashboard. What we've done is we've taken, I'm sure I got the name on that wrong, but we've taken data on local resilience projects from each of our jurisdictions. Actually, we've got data from 12 of them right now, 12 of our 17. And we put that into one place so we have information on the status, the cost, where it is, what type of project it is. So we're putting that regional picture of resilience implementation together so that hopefully our decision makers can get a better understanding of the scope of this problem, and we'll all agree to fund it and help localities do the implementation that is necessary. And at this point, we have about 350 projects in that database across our region with about $3 to $3.5 billion of projects identified. So it's a big project, and that's just Hampton Roads. That doesn't even get into what's going on in Northern Virginia, Richmond, or anywhere else along in the coastal Virginia, and not to say anything about the inland areas, which are also vulnerable to flooding. So So a lot of good work going there. We have an effort right now that just kind of completed. We have a new website called getfloodfluent.org. We're trying to encourage people to buy flood insurance. A lot of that information, the products we developed for that, is actually available for others to download. Very, very little of it is Hampton Roads specific, so if you're interested in encouraging flood insurance purchases by your community, I would encourage you to check out that website. Again, that's getfloodfluent.org. That was provided or funded in part by a grant from DCR. We are, another thing we're working on right now on the planning side is actually we are working with our friends at the Navy on a couple of joint land use studies, one tackling the installations in Norfolk and Virginia Beach, and another tackling the installations in Portsmouth and Chesapeake, northern Chesapeake. And the idea behind these studies is to directly coordinate with the Navy to figure out how issues in the community, flooding, infrastructure decay, traffic, land use conflicts, are negatively impacting military operations and readiness, and so that we can develop recommendations for those communities to reduce those conflicts and potentially identify some infrastructure that, again, would hopefully get funded by Congress if they ever appropriate money for the Defense Community Infrastructure Program. So, and lastly, we are advocating for state and federal funding. This is an important issue, I think, at the national level. It seems to be getting a little bit more attention. Unfortunately, at the state level, aside from a little bit of funding for, I think, tangentially related issues like water quality or the coastal program, that there has not been dedicated funding for resilience, for sea level rise adaptation at the state level. And so getting that changed at the General Assembly is probably a years-long effort, but it's something that we're working on quite a bit. And then before I wrap up, I want to just highlight a few of the local efforts that are going on. The city of Norfolk recently, they got a grant from the National Disaster Resilience Competition and Chesterfield Heights neighborhood, so they're supposed to be going out to construction, I think, later this fall on that project. So that's really exciting to see the kind of the mix of adaptation strategies that they're going to be implementing in that neighborhood. A few years ago, they adopted Vision 2100, which is a long 100-year vision. So most communities plan for about 25 or 30 years in their comprehensive plan. This was a century-long look at what they wanted their city to look like, particularly in the face of sea level rise, to figure out which areas they think they could adapt, which ones they could move to and focus their development on, which ones they should protect, and which assets they could potentially let go into the sea at some point if necessary. And then they recently adopted a new zoning ordinance, which is starting to implement some of the recommendations from that plan. The city of Virginia Beach has just recently completed a comprehensive sea level rise plan that includes a number of policies and adaptation options, and they're developing a number of strategies, engineering strategies that they can use that their city council is going to be looking at and considering later this year. In addition, they're also working on, they've put out for public comment some changes to their public facilities design standards, so things like what the tailwater conditions are required to be for new development, what the new design flood elevations will be, how they're going to incorporate not just sea level rise, but also changing precipitation. So a lot of exciting work there, and we're hoping to take that work and recommend it regionally as well. And then the city of Hampton, one last local project, does a community planning effort called Resilient Hampton, which is looking at resilience in a much more holistic manner. I think one of the benefits and the neat things about being in Hampton Roads is that we do have quite a bit of capacity at the local level, and so our localities can try different things. And so we're able to learn different lessons. They're not all trying the same approach. And so we can see what works better, and we can then farm that out and recommend that to the other localities that may not be taking the lead as much. So again, we've been working on this issue for a long time in Hampton Roads for over a decade now. We are working together. I think we get a bad rap for not working together as well as I think we do. We're also working not just regionally, but also with our state agencies and with our federal stakeholders in Hampton Roads. The military is critical. The port is a critical part of Hampton Roads, and we want to keep them there. And then also we're working, I think some of the phrases that come from our decision makers, I can't repeat all of them, but one of them one of the deputy city managers from Virginia Beach refers to some of the older developments in our region as sea level rise time bombs, that the decisions we've made over the last few decades in terms of development will come back to haunt us because we underbuilt the infrastructure. We built in areas that are not going to be sustainable to be in or are going to cost a lot to protect in the future. And so coming up with new standards, new policies, and implementing those through our zoning ordinance and other regulations at the local level is key to making sure that the problem doesn't get any bigger than it already is, because it's already, as we've already identified, it's already a pretty, I won't say insurmountable, but certainly is quite a large challenge for us to deal with in the Hampton Roads region. And so we'd like to take action sooner rather than later to make sure that we factor these changes that we can foresee into into the plans that we're doing now and the projects we're doing now to keep that project from getting the problem from getting any bigger.
Well, thank you very much. Really, really interesting work across the board here. I was taking notes so I can steal or maybe borrow some of the ideas that you guys have put forward, and I think that's part of what we're here for here, is to be able to share these types of things. One other thing I actually heard about yesterday from the National Association of State Energy Officials, David Terry, is that he said the FEMA Disaster Recovery Reform Act that was passed this last year is going to require FEMA to take 6% of the funds that go for disaster recovery and pull them out and put them into the disaster mitigation program that will be available nationwide. So even if there's a local disaster recovery effort, these funds will be pulled out, and those funds will be available for more than just that particular area. And so 6% is going to be a big number. Once we look at the billion-dollar disasters that we have been seeing more and more of. And right now FEMA is just kind of beginning to figure out how to make this work. So it's something I think to keep your eye open for as a funding method, as a funding source for some of these types of resiliency projects going forward. So I'll start maybe with confession time for the questions here. You know, we've talked, and we love to talk about all the things that we're doing, but I think we also learn from our errors. And so, for example, in our region, one of the things that we've not really done well enough is being urgent enough in getting things moving. We just take too darn long scratching our heads and talking to each other and figuring it out. And so one of the things that we need to do, you know, the coastal flood study that we are now about to kick off, we've been trying to get that going since 2017, and it's just too long. But we're there, and I'm glad for that. And so we need to figure out a way to really to ramp up, and a lot of that has to do with convincing our leaders to put some resources into the planning efforts that are needed to be able to get the things going. But that's I think one of the biggest things that we've been looking at right now is just we need to have a better sense of urgency. So I guess I'd ask, are there things that you've done that if you were to go back and redo, you'd like to do a little bit different or a little bit better so that we can learn from mistakes? Nobody likes to admit their mistakes, but
actually, Steve mentioned the 3x3x3 studies with the Corps of Engineers, and we've been trying to get one of those going, or several of those actually going in Hampton Roads for a number of years now. And I think the mistake that we made was that we didn't realize all the different processes and timelines that we would need to do, and so we were able to get kind of money at the General Assembly for match, but we didn't have the authorization. And now we have the authorization, but there's no appropriation at the Corps. Mm-hmm. And so because we weren't ready and we didn't have the authorization and the appropriation, Northern Virginia was able to steal our money and go and do the project. So reappropriated at the General Assembly. So making sure, like, when you have, especially these programs that require, you'd like for everything to be ready at the same time. And I think sometimes, depending on decision makers, they have a lot of things they're concerned about. And when you tell them, thanks for the money, but we have to sit on that for a few years, they don't really like to hear that. And so I think if we were to go back, we would have engaged the Corps and figured out that process earlier, so we would hopefully be at the same stage that you're at now.
From your experience that you kind of have individual activities and now kind of working together at your levels in this region here, any kind of things that you would say, gee, I'd like to do that differently? Or you just, sometimes I know you get lost in the process and you don't really, and maybe a little new enough that you're not doing it, but any thoughts?
So I would say for the county, I wouldn't say necessarily it was like a mistake, but I think if we could do it all over again, and this is my personal professional opinion, I would have liked to have had the county Corps, like climate action planning team, have spent a little more time on defining our scope. Like when I started in September of last year, there was already laid out sort of like what they were calling the plan for the plan, like how they were going to sort of coalesce staff and resources around doing our climate action planning. But it was almost immediately clear to me when I started that there wasn't buy-in necessarily from everyone about whether or not this was just going to be mitigation. Was this going to be mitigation and adaptation? was this going to be like resiliency, and then what did that really mean? And so we spent a lot of time, like when we were trying to explain to people what it is we wanted additional staff time for, what are we even doing? And I think it made the process a little slower in the beginning. And I also think it made us had to backtrack a little bit, saying that like, oh, maybe we bit off more than we could chew.
So Susan mentioned the Global Covenant of Mayors, and that's a really interesting thing, that it's more than just one of the pledges that people sign up for. There's some really things that you've got to do for that, and we're fortunate that they're going to be providing technical assistance in our area to our localities to kind of run through the protocols. Have you found, again, with Narissa, what you were saying, you got to kind of think about the framework and the language and how you approach it. Has the Global Covenant of Mayors been helpful in that process?
Yes.
Good answer.
So the reporting platform that the Global Covenant of Mayors uses is called CDP. And it stands for Carbon Disclosure Project, but as they become a broader global one, a global company and presence, they've actually just rebranded their name to just CDP. I feel like every year when I go into the reporting tool, I discover that there's new questions that I'm supposed to be answering, which can be a little bit frustrating when you plan out, you look at like a year timeline. You say, okay, we're going to be getting ready to do this. This is all the pieces. These are all the players, reaching out to new partners, discovering new efforts that have been happening and trying to kind of bring all that together. And then you get to within a month or two of your reporting deadline and you go, oh, and there's now all this other stuff that we didn't know we had to answer. And so in some ways it is helpful because it does lay out that framework and it lays out the questions. It also can feel like it's reflective of the fact that I think this is an evolving space that communities around the world are going through, of really starting to get into the weeds of saying, okay, we went through our first iteration, but there's these other pieces that weren't addressed. Now, how do we roll those in? And depending on where you're coming in that timeline, it can kind of feel a little bit like you're constantly trying to catch up. And so in that way, it feels like it's a constant challenge. But having that framework out there, especially one of the things that they're trying to do through their platform, is to put that baseline standard so communities can compare to other communities. And then they're trying to, once they have a sense of that consistency, they are actively looking at how can they start bringing new resources, whether it's financial resources or sharing strategies, best practices, methods, so that you can start to really learn from each other across the world, rather than it being kind of this saying, well, but they're different in this way, and we don't really see exactly how we overlap.
So we'll be hopefully learning from each other as we're doing some of the GCOM work in our area, and keep in touch on that. One of the things that all three of us are really looking at the regional level of things, and we all face with our localities having different priorities. You mentioned this some in your discussions about Albemarle, Charlottesville area. But in limitations, each jurisdiction has its different drivers and things. And so one of the things that we work on is to try and put things together and not go to the lowest common denominator, but try and get to the highest common denominator. And so what are some of the efforts that you're doing to try and work that process? And I know in the Charlottesville area, just getting your staff together and talking with each other, the STAR team that we have here today on the panel is one of the ways to help make that happen. But are there other things within your political leadership and others that they're stepping up to do that?
I think it really helps from some of the experience that we've had. We were fortunate to host a Dutch Dialogues workshop with folks from the embassy and from the Netherlands that came over back in 2015 with Hampton and Norfolk. And we had a group that was looking at these regional issues. And the key takeaway, and it's hard to admit this as a regional planner, but is that collaboration is not always a good thing. Collaboration and coordination, they have a cost, and time and money, and not getting what you want. And so for us, we've really tried hard with our resiliency program to figure out those things where it makes sense for our localities to coordinate on, where it's worth the effort when they come together. And stay away from the things where it's just adding another layer of bureaucracy to the process and not having a positive outcome. So keeping kind of that always in our mind of like, is this really worth doing regionally? And if it's not, then we just kind of set it aside, and because we have limited time, limited capacity at our agency as well. I think the other thing that we have changed regionally is that there's because there's a recognition of the importance of this issue. Localities, the region, the Planning District Commission is not as concerned about, like if we like issue a resolution, for example, everyone knows that at the PDC doing that, it doesn't really mean anything in terms of implementation because we don't have, actual jurisdictional authority to require anything. But it's a statement of support for doing that kind of work, but it doesn't imply any sort of obligation on our localities. And so they've been more willing to kind of make these public stances through the Planning District Commission when they know that they're going to be responsible for implementing and that it goes through that whole separate process and they can make a decision to go either way. And I think as a result, when one locality steps up, other localities think, I might not be able to do that just yet, but I might want to do that in 5 years. And so I'm going to support what they're doing now through the region, but I don't need to worry about, for example, implementing new design standards just yet. I'll get to that in my good time, but I want to support, Virginia Beach or Norfolk or whatever in doing what they're doing regionally. And that's just a change in attitude.
Yeah, I think that's one of the strengths I've seen in yours, that you set these broad kind of directions that you're going, but you let each jurisdiction work within its schedule. And so I think that's one of the strengths of what you've set up. And I see you're kind of shaking your head some here.
Yeah, I think for UVA and the Office for Sustainability, one thing we've tried to be really deliberate about is that sustainability doesn't just happen in the Office for Sustainability, and we're not necessarily the key drivers of everything. So UVA has a pretty extensive network of committees, working groups, task forces that the Office for Sustainability helps facilitate and helps guide and helps support. But we look to those, the University Committee on Sustainability, Sustainable Food Strategy Task Force, or the Civic Engagement Subcommittee, and all these different groups that we're part of, but we're bringing in these different stakeholders. I think particularly with resilience planning, so much of that is outside an Office for Sustainability. If you think about resiliency in energy and utilities or in water, or if you look at some of the social indicators or the biodiversity, some of the biodiversity land planning type aspects, all are sort of outside our realm but connected to us. So we try to use these working groups and networks and subcommittees and committees to help drive direction so that as many people as possible have a voice. But I think it's a challenging thing to do to make sure everyone is represented as needed.
And speaking of everybody having a voice, one of the challenges that we often find in this is integrating equity information and equity processes into the planning processes. And so we'll have things in our region. The Fairfax County Board has set up its One Fairfax initiative that requires us to be, when Fairfax County and others working with them are dealing with issues, to look at it through the equity lens. So within the whole area of sustainability and resiliency, are you taking in any particular efforts to build equity and equity assessments and environmental justice considerations into your work?
That's actually, that's really good timing, because yes. So one of the things as we've been going through the process of getting community input towards setting the new reduction target was intermixed with that were also feedback and comments we're getting from the community about what they wanted to see in what we ultimately ended up doing in terms of action. Mm-hmm. And so as part of that process, we actually brought forth a resolution that our council adopted that identified a couple of pieces, a couple of key topics that we had been hearing from the community that needed to be addressed in what we do with climate action. We felt as staff that they should be addressed in there. And so the resolution proposal to council was really for them to affirm that, yes, they also, as our policy setting board, want to see these and provide that assurance that these will be addressed in what we bring forward. That also sets the stage for us to be able to start working and reaching out to really be able to address those. One of those pieces was addressing how do you talk about equity in terms of climate action. Mm-hmm. And there's a recognition that if you're looking at just mitigation in terms of you want to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, whether you're looking at improving the insulation of somebody's home versus putting a couple of solar panels on there or paying your utility to provide you with renewable energy. All three of those ways can end up getting you the same greenhouse gas emission reduction. So how do you choose between them? And that's really where it's what those other values are, what your community are, other commitments and goals that your organization has. And so if you start looking at how do you talk about equity in terms of housing in a community? What's that quality of experience that when you go home, what should that be? What should that, what's called the energy burden? So what percentage of your monthly income is going to your utility bills? When you turn on your heat and it's cold outside, are your walls still cold? How was that comfort level? And those are the pieces where if you're starting to look at, well, we're going to insulate and air seal a home versus we're going to just ask that resident to pay the utility extra for providing green power, you start to have that mitigation greenhouse gas reduction piece to it, but you really start to also see what are these other, what typically are called co-benefits, but how do you start addressing these other challenges in the community and things around equity? And I said it was good timing because it's something that Narissa and I have been talking a lot about. Both of our organizations have other offices that are focusing on the issues of equity, either internal or external. And so we were trying to figure out as looking at a community scope, what do we need in order to help us better integrate this conversation into the climate action planning? And then there were a couple of pieces that UVA actually has work on that we were going to actually next week after we finish up this conference reach out to Andrea to say, this is the results of our brainstorm. How does this fit with what you see in your world?
So time is going quickly, and there's less than 5 minutes left. Are there questions from the audience? I think I saw the first hand here, and then we'll go down to in the middle here. So why don't you just stand up and yell out to start with? I know you have a loud voice.
Hey, I really enjoyed the presentation, Steve. Excellent point on urgency. I was wondering, I know that I spoke yesterday at a circular economy, and it was a great example there of how circular Charlotte, North Carolina, reached out to Amsterdam to find best practices, really great things that are going on, how it can help their city. Similarly, are you also looking at kind of other areas outside the United States or Europe where they just realize how important this issue is to help guide you in your plan? Thank you.
So in our region, in Metropolitan Washington, we're fortunate that we have all of these embassies and everything right there. And so, yes, we have done quite a bit of that. We just, Northern Virginia Regional Commission just sent a group to Germany. We've had groups going to Belgium and looking at kind of what the EU is doing. So we try and learn as much as we can. I think the Dutch have been very active from New York City to Hampton Roads to our area to help teach us a little bit better how to do these types of things. Well, for example, the Northern Virginia Regional Commission had a Dutch water quality planner there for, I don't know if it was 6 or 9 months or so, to work with them on teaching the localities within their footprint some of the practices that have been done on the Room for the River program and other things like that. So it's concrete, getting people there to do the type of work and learning from that. And I think, Ben, you mentioned the Dutch having come by.
Yes, so we hosted the Dutch Dialogue, so we actually had some folks come over from the Netherlands for that workshop. The city of Hampton has actually had a few of them come back as part of the Resilient Hampton process they're doing. They contracted with Wagner and Ball, which was the firm that did the original Dutch Dialogues in New Orleans. And so they've been able to kind of keep those connections alive. A number of our localities have made trips overseas. We are looking at the work that's going on domestically and internationally. Unfortunately, I just haven't been able to get on one of those trips yet.
And the district is about to do a study in the southwest portion of DC to do cloudburst analysis, and that's really come out of Trimble, which is one of the European companies that we have been kind of learning from. And they've done cloudburst analysis up in parts of New York City, for example, and learning from that. Let's go ahead with the question right here.
I'll second Janine's comment. Excellent panel, and express deep thanks and admiration for you guys in your roles. You're on the front lines. It's going to get worse. You should have started sooner. We should be throwing more money at you, and it's going to get complicated. Life is what happens when you're making other plans, right? So I'm going to focus on Bend, but the issues are clearly, heat waves, rainfall patterns, whatever. But sea level rise is, I heard your projections are based on 2080, 2100 time frame, 4.5-foot sea level rise. The IPCC models have a RCP 8.5 trajectory, which is their top trajectory. That's the one we seem to be on. That has a 7 and a 4-inch sea level rise by 2100. So you're already behind the 8 ball. How do you adjust to that? We make these plans. I think we're going to find that things are accelerating. Just the news in the last couple of weeks is talking about Iceland, ice is slipping, Antarctica is melting faster than, so we may see accelerated rates of change. In the fog of war, you have to have a retreat plan. What's the retreat plan when we are forced to go to higher ground? How do we create our organizations in such a way that we can adapt to these changes as they're coming at us?
So I guess I'll answer that in two parts. First is that it's not just that we've adopted those scenarios, but the work and the research and the analysis continues, not just at the regional level, but all the localities as well. That we monitor new developments in science and research is out there to make sure that the policies that we are considering are good policies. And so those are, if conditions change, then the policies will change to account for that. On the other side of your mentioned retreat, and the attitude in Hampton Roads is that we're not retreating. There are areas where there will be, selective buyouts of properties. That's already been going on for a number of years now in certain low-lying areas. But the political mindset is that we're there to stay, and we're trying to figure out what we need in order to do that. Now, if that conversation changes, that's possible. But I think in terms of a practical perspective, saying now that we need to evacuate from Hampton Roads permanently is well, one, it's a non-starter, but also it doesn't, I think, make a lot of sense from an economic perspective or from a socio-economic perspective. That there's still a lot of time left in Hampton Roads, even if under those those higher scenarios of sea level rise. And honestly, it just wouldn't go anywhere. We wouldn't make any headway with our decision makers, and we wouldn't make any headway with the public if we even tried to have that conversation. So from a feasibility perspective, it's more about figuring out what we need to do now in order to kind of make our communities more resilient, even in the face of change.
I think that's exactly right. We got to look at what we can do now and then realize we'll be having to adapt over time. Well, I see it's 10:02 on the clock that is down next to the screen there, so I think I probably have to turn this back to Annette because she's trying to keep all of us on schedule as the day goes along. So I'd like to very much thank the panel for being here. And again, let's learn and steal from each other through today, tomorrow, and the years ahead.
Thank you, Steve.